Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Fadhel Kaboub, and it's my pleasure to talk to you virtually this afternoon, this early evening. So here's what I want to cover today. The title of the presentation is Climate Stress, the Untold Story of the Arab Uprisings. And by climate stress, some people ask me, do you mean like climate as in environmental factors or political climate? It's actually both. So this is kind of my point. We have 1 hour scheduled today, so I'll try to breeze through the PowerPoint and leave enough time for discussion and for questions. But if you have any questions as I'm going through the slides, please feel free to raise your hand or draw my attention for clarification purposes. But I'll make sure we have enough time for questions at the end. So with that, I'm assuming you see the full screen for the PowerPoint, right?
Yep, the full screen. I'll just hit the record.
Okay. So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start here with some basic climate data, and this should animate in a second. So this is, some of you may have seen this in terms of the global warming effects, and the red line, the first red circle is 1.5 degrees, and then the second circle is 2 degrees Celsius, which most scientists will tell you this will be a point of no return. I'm going to replay the animation one more time so you can see the data moving by year, starting with the 1850s, sort of when the Industrial Revolution kicks in, and then things really start to accelerate in the last few years, the last couple of decades, and in a way that's extremely worrisome in terms of global effects. So this is where we are today, 2017, pretty much reaching the 1.5 Celsius degrees. In terms of carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions, this data here goes back thousands of years, so you can see on this axis the dates pretty much. And then we human beings show up here and bring in the Industrial Revolution, and things start to accelerate in an exponential way. And here, in terms of concentration in the atmosphere, we're reaching the 400 ppm level, which is, again, we're breaching into uncharted territory, and we're breaching into what a lot of people call the point of no return. So this highlights the urgency of climate action on one end, and intervention of a scale that sort of resembles the intervention during World War II in terms of military intervention. So massive intervention to try to undo some of the damage before it's too late. So here I'm starting with some global factors, and then I'm going to zoom in on the Middle East in particular. This is sort of where, world leaders decided, finally realized we're really messing up the environment to a point that will force us to make some economic decisions. So here you look at the contribution to CO2 emissions by the US, the EU, China, and then the rest of the world, which includes a lot of developing countries. And the idea is that by 2030, we're supposed to, lower these things. But yes, investing in renewable energy can help and everything, but the truth of the matter is that most developing countries are just not there, don't have the resources, and are sort of telling the rest of the world, well, it's not fair that you guys, polluted the environment during your process of economic development, and now you're asking us to halt our economic development process to accommodate the rest of the world. So there's a political issue at stake here that's deeply economic in nature, because this is fueling economic growth, obviously. How are we going to fuel economic growth if we stop polluting? And the technical solutions are there. It's just governments around the world haven't invested enough yet. to switch us to completely 100% renewable energy production, at least in terms of electricity. So there's a global issue there. And as I move into the Middle East topic, I want to start with the first thought, just to make sure that we're on the same page, that I'm not saying things that I'm not meaning to say here. So what I'm trying to argue is that climate change does not automatically cause wars, but it can contribute to amplifying already existing social tensions, economic dislocation, ethnic divisions that often lead to armed conflict. So there's no direct cause and effect. You know, global warming immediately leads to war and destruction. But global warming, climate change does exacerbate and amplify existing tensions, social and economic and ethnic and other sort of tensions. And my point about the Syrian conflict in particular is that this played a significant role in the lead up to the conflict, which is not a story you usually hear about when you think about the Syrian conflict. So to emphasize some of the key factors in the Middle East, we have water scarcity, which I'll emphasize a little bit in the next few slides. We have major droughts that are intensifying in recent years, heat waves that are intensifying in recent years and will continue. The issue of deforestation, desertification, with the desert sort of taking over some of the what used to be fertile land in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Loss of biodiversity because of climate change. So all of these factors are not just environmental factors, but they have economic effects. And as a result, once you put stress on the economic factors, you put stress on the social and political factors, which is the point that I'm trying to emphasize today. And then you have obviously the issue of air and water and land pollution globally, but specifically in the Middle East region, Middle East and North Africa. I have a couple of these slides just to show you some samples of what the weather looks like these days in the summertime. So these are becoming sort of standard, temperatures that you see in the region, especially in parts of Iraq and Kuwait and Iran, that are essentially, scientists have come out in the last couple of years and have estimated that within our lifetime, within the next 50 years, we're going to reach a point where the summer months in the Middle East will make the region simply uninhabitable, and that's just unheard of in our in recent human history. So you see maps that look like this in the weather forecast in the summertime in the region. In terms of water issues, so this map shows the water-stressed regions of the world. So the darker the color, the more water-stressed, and you can tell that big parts of North Africa and the Middle East are extremely water-stressed. So way below what we would consider acceptable level of access to water for human consumption. And this is also important for agricultural production, obviously. The other thing I want to emphasize about this map, that this is sort of a macro picture. There's even more intense water stress in sub-regions within each one of these countries. So there's, within countries, very severe regional disparities between, say, coastal areas that tend to have a lot of industry and tourism and get prioritized in terms of serving that population with water. And a lot of the rural communities that already have lots of unemployment and poverty and economic problems tend to fall into the category of second-class citizens when it comes to allocating water resources during the summer months in the last few years. So dozens and dozens of towns across the region are simply living weeks at a time without water, without access to water. And that's just intensifying in the last few years. The World Bank did this study a few years ago, trying to estimate the environmental cost, the economic cost of environmental degradation. And they looked at all of these countries in the Middle East. And the World Bank is not your most progressive institution when it comes to looking at climate change and things of that nature. But even with the most conservative estimates, we're looking at 8% of GDP, 6, 7, 8% of GDP lost due to environmental degradation because of water issues and land issues and pollution issues, essentially. So there is a serious economic cost that climate change is putting on the region in the last few years. And what I want to do next is go over a couple of examples in recent history in the regions where the water issue in particular has contributed directly to conflict in the region. So I'll talk about the River Jordan, which is related to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'll talk about the Iran-Iraq war and the role of water in that conflict. Then I'll talk about the Nile River, which is still an ongoing conflict and could potentially spark another confrontation between Egypt on the one hand in particular and Ethiopia in particular. So I'll just take you through the maps. There'll be a lot of maps just to see where things are and what we're looking at. So this is a map of the region that includes Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon up here in the north. So here we're looking at an entire region that's essentially fed by these smaller rivers that are coming from Lebanon and then going all the way down the Jordan River. So the Jordan River is this long stream here that ends in the Dead Sea, which borders Jordan, the West Bank, Israel. So an entire region fed by essentially one source, and all of these countries depend, and this is a question of life and death, because it's not only it's a source of water, it's a source of irrigation, a sort of drinking water, but it's a source of producing electricity. And if one country upstream decides to build a hydroelectric plant or diverts the streams in a different direction, everybody else downstream will suffer. So this is a major source of conflict, has been a major source of conflict from the beginning, and it still is to this day. This is Shatt al-Arab, is this small, relatively small river that connects the two rivers that go through Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates, that connect in this stream that eventually, sorry, I'm going to go back, that eventually goes into the Persian Gulf, and that becomes the end of the stream here is a border between Iran and Iraq, and that to some extent contributed to the conflict in the 80s that sparked the war between Iran and Iraq. Obviously, there were other issues in that conflict, but the control of the river was part of the conflict. And then finally, I want to talk about the Nile River, which, as you can see here, the map, the flow of the Nile, just to give you an idea here, flows from the southern part of Africa all the way upstream to Egypt, through Egypt, and then into the Mediterranean. So the countries, especially Ethiopia here, Ethiopia for a long time has been trying to build dams to control the flow of the Blue Nile, right here, and to produce electricity using the flow of the Blue Nile. The problem with that is that it slows down the flow of water that goes through Sudan and then eventually into Egypt. In Egypt, for Egypt, this is literally a question of life and death in terms of the Nile being the only source of water for the whole country. The Nile also being the only source for irrigation. And the entire agricultural industry of Egypt depends exclusively on the Nile River, not just in terms of water, but also in terms of the minerals that the Nile River brings to the fertile land in Egypt. So if you reduce the flow, not only you have less water to drink, less water to irrigate, but you also have fewer minerals to fertilize the land in that part of the country. And at some point, Back in the late 60s, early 70s, Ethiopia was planning to build a dam, started actually to build the dam at very early stages. And what Egypt did at that time is simply, scramble fighter jets and destroy the dam. So for Egypt, it's a question of national security. Right now, the Ethiopian government is constantly negotiating with the Egyptians, negotiating with all the other countries that are affected by this, but especially with Egypt, because when the British left the region, they said the Nile River belongs to Egypt. And Egypt is very serious about keeping that agreement in place. But the other countries are saying, well, that was colonialism and we're not going to necessarily accept that. So right now, Ethiopia is in the process of building the dam which, will be in place soon. There's a lot of military security around that. So right before building the dam, Ethiopia bought quite a bit of anti-aircraft defense systems just to make sure that that nothing happens in terms of an attack from Egypt or any other country. So this is already a very tense moment for what's going to happen to the control of water in the region. And what I'm saying here is that climate change is not going to make this any easier in the future. If anything, it's going to intensify the fight for water resources and other, especially for water in the region. So climate change is not going to help on this front. And now I want to talk about the Syrian conflict in particular and bring in the issue of climate change to what I consider one of the root causes of the conflict. So first, just to highlight the extent of the tragedy, and some of these are estimates, but just to put things in context, I mean, the UN is estimating more than 400,000 people have died since the beginning of the conflict, possibly more. 11 million people displaced, 6.6 million refugees, 4.4 million internally displaced within Syria. We're talking about, when people talk about the largest refugee crisis that we've dealt with in recent history, this is not an exaggeration. Not to mention the massive infrastructure destruction in terms of schools and hospitals and everything else that Syria suffered from. The UN is asking for billions of dollars worth of aid from the international community. Not much of that has been awarded at this point. Usually, whatever the UN asks for, they barely get half of that amount. So there's a serious humanitarian crisis that we should keep in mind. The climate change issue, and this is the part that not a lot of people have emphasized when we talk about the Syrian conflict. The traditional story that you hear is that, the Arab uprising started in Tunisia and then spread through Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, and Syria was just another example of that. So there's some truth to that, because there was the pro-democracy movement, the students and the professors and the lawyers and human rights activists who protested and started the Syrian version of the Arab uprisings. But very quickly, there was so many other groups that were part of that uprising, and the conflict turned very violent very quickly. But the part that's often not emphasized is the role of climate change and the lead up to that moment in 2011. So between 2006, 2011, Syria went through the most intense and the most severe drought in its history. And to put things in context, there were 3 million people affected by that drought, mostly in rural areas. 1 million people experienced food insecurity during that time period. And this is before the conflict. This is just the drought. 1.5 million people were displaced from rural areas in Syria and had to move to larger cities. So you have an exodus of the population. And the reason people left is because their livelihood was disappearing. Agricultural yields declined by 32% in irrigated areas, so areas that had access to irrigation, and it declined by 80% in areas that depend exclusively on rainfall. So that's a massive destruction of economic output, but also source of livelihood for those people who had to leave. Syria had self-sufficiency in food production for a long time. That was one of its strongest and proudest achievements over the years. And during this drought, for the first time in a long time, Syria became a net importer of food, a net importer of wheat. And this is happening, if you remember also the 2008 financial crisis was followed by a period where commodity prices were increasing across the world. So you become a net importer of wheat at a time when global wheat prices are increasing dramatically. So not good timing, economically speaking. Agricultural production fell from 25% of GDP in 2003 to 17% of GDP in 2011. So a massive loss of, a big chunk of the industry was lost because of the drought. And then livestock, 85% of livestock in Syria died during the drought. And that's a massive source of, production of milk and meat and so on that was lost during this period. So this is not just your regular drought, a temporary shock. This is a massive dislocation that happened. So now you have increase in urban and rural poverty and unemployment, but most of this now is concentrated in the cities. So this puts stress on the resources available in the city in terms of housing, in terms of access to jobs, in terms of schools, in terms of hospitals, in terms of all the major, regular activities are now experiencing more demand, and as a result, more inflation. So at a time when you're producing less food, you're dependent on more imports and more expensive imports. So there's food inflation too. And that puts more stress on government resources, obviously. So when you factor in all of these effects, again, not these effects, I'm not saying that these effects is what caused the uprising, but these effects, in addition to the other pre-existing social tensions, political tensions, pro-democracy movement, and everything else that's already there, these things simply add fuel to that spark that fueled the conflict. And my point is that we're gonna probably see more of these things as climate change puts more stress on urban areas and rural areas of this kind, the kind that I'm describing here in the Syrian situation. It's just not going to be conducive to peace and stability and security. If anything, it's going to be adding fuel to the fire, so to speak, for a region that's already unstable because of a variety of historical, political, and social and ethnic divisions in some cases. So the other source of the conflict that's not related to water is related to energy production, and it's related to energy exports. And as soon as you hear energy production or exports and you hear this in the context of the Middle East, the first thing that comes to mind is oil. Well, I'm not going to argue that it's oil. Oil is there and it's important and everything, but the next big thing, and it's already happening, is natural gas. And this is, in my opinion, one of the major driving forces behind the conflict in Syria in particular, but really throughout the region. It's really reshaping the political map in the region. And as I'll explain later in this presentation, I'm not arguing that we should push towards more gas explorations and dependence on gas and oil. But this is an economic reality that's happening. It's a political reality. So I think we need to address it. And here, the nature of the conflict is simply as follows. So the major global producers of natural gas, you have Russia as the major supplier of Western Europe. About 80% of natural gas consumption in Western Europe comes from Russia. Europe doesn't like that. Europe would like to diversify its sources of natural gas. They're investing in renewable energy and everything else, but natural gas is a major thing. After Russia, the two big players, globally speaking, are Iran and Qatar. So Qatar and Iran share a major field, natural gas field in the Gulf, and they can become major suppliers for Europe if they can deliver natural gas through a pipeline to the European market. Right now, Qatar is a major player in the natural gas market, but the way they deliver it to the rest of the world is by liquefying the gas, which is a very expensive process. So you have to build a plant that transforms the gas that you're extracting into a liquid form. So to transform it into LNG, liquefied natural gas. So you have to liquefy it, load it on massive ships, ship it across the oceans, deliver it to your consumers, and then at the delivery point, you have to turn it back into gas. So you take the LNG, the liquefied gas, and you turn it into gas one more time for final consumption. So it's a pretty involved process in terms of transportation and transformation, and it's a pretty expensive process. The cheapest way to do it is to directly build a pipeline from the source to the final consumers, and this way you don't have to, so it will lower prices dramatically. So obviously both Qatar and Iran would love to have that, direct access to consumers, but it means building a pipeline. So there were two competing proposals for building a pipeline, a Qatari pipeline and an Iranian pipeline that's backed by the Russians. So there's obviously a political alliance between Russia and Iran. Russia would like to have Iran be its competitor in Europe. So you'd rather have your competitor be politically aligned with you, as opposed to have a true competitor like Qatar that will challenge you on political issues, on economic issues. So Russia is saying, if somebody has to share the market with us, I'd rather have, Iran shared with us rather than Qatar. So this is sort of a sketch of the proposed pipelines. The red line that you see here is the Iranian proposed pipeline, which goes through Iran and then through Iraq and then through Syria, and then from Syria directly through the Mediterranean Sea to European markets. So notice the direction here. So Iraq is part of the Iranian satellite of influence because of the Shia dominated government in Iraq. Syria is a political ally of Iran, so they're happy to accommodate. So that's the Iranian proposal. The Qatari proposal, the blue pipeline here, sketched in this map, goes from Qatar to Saudi Arabia, an ally of Qatar, obviously, and then through Jordan, also an ally of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And then the proposal was to go through Syria, and then from Syria to Turkey, and then from Turkey to the rest of Europe. So this brings in Turkey into the picture. These two proposals were brought to the Syrian government literally a few days, a few weeks before the conflict actually started. I'm talking about December 2010. And at the time, Bashar al-Assad told the Qataris, sorry, I'm signing the deal with the Iranians. And that means the Iranians will have access to the European market, and the Qatari natural gas is simply would become not competitive price-wise, because your production process is way more expensive than the direct delivery through pipeline. And for Qatar, as a small country that depends exclusively on exports of natural gas, this is a huge setback economically. And the Qataris, they see it as a question of life and death. This is your main source of income, of power, of influence. That's going to be taken away forever, essentially. Which explains why, as soon as the proposal for this blue pipeline was rejected by Syria, because both pipelines have to go through Syria, number one, Turkey was very upset because they've been pushed out of the deal. Turkey was pretty close ally of Syria up to that point, and that's when they immediately closed diplomatic relations and economic relations with Syria. And that's when you can directly see the influence of the interest of the Qatari government and its allies in overthrowing the Syrian regime and putting in place a regime that will be more friendly to the interest of the region. The other major political map that you see here is the Shiite crescent that connects Iran, Iraq, Syria, to Lebanon, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is also a Shia organization. This is not just a sort of a religious map; it's a political map, and it's a military alliance sort of map that influences the region and challenges the interests of the Sunni governments in the region. So there's that as well. Bashar al-Assad obviously being not a Sunni, but a Shia. A Shia minority in Syria itself. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about this map. But this wouldn't be the only natural gas pipeline. Everybody else in the region has a little bit of natural gas, Egypt in particular. So many countries in the region, they don't really care which pipeline gets built as long as they can connect to it and sell to Europe, because that's a major market. So Jordan is interested in this, Egypt is interested in this. So there's already an existing pipeline that goes from Egypt to Jordan through Israel and to Syria. And the idea is that the Egyptians would be able to connect to whichever pipeline is built and be able to sell to Europe as well. There's very large new discoveries in the region, especially off the coast of Gaza, off the coast of Israel and Lebanon, and there's a lot of disputed areas that are still waiting for final settlements and final approval. So yet another source of conflict here. This highlighted dark area where it says disputed area between Israel and Lebanon, one of the largest fields was recently discovered here. There's the whole issue of the Gaza Strip, massive natural gas fields discovered right off the coast that Israel wants to take over. But the Palestinian Authority would like to have that as a source of income for the development of the Palestinian economy. So that's another element that is already intensifying the conflict in the region. I have this map just to emphasize that this area up here is the Caspian Sea, which is another area that has a massive reserve of natural gas that's shared by 6 countries, including Russia, and that's yet to be explored commercially. Again, it involves building a pipeline through a whole bunch of countries, and require a whole bunch of political settlements, and would eventually connect possibly through the Middle East. So I just wanted to throw that in there as yet another possibility for this. So now I want to zoom in quickly on some economic realities for non-oil exporting countries in the region. Here I'm talking about smaller countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Tunisia and Morocco and Yemen, from where they stand economically and how these issues will affect them, are already affecting them. So the economic reality is that these countries, the non-oil exporting countries, right? Countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Morocco, and so on, and Lebanon, they suffer from a structural trade deficit, meaning they have a systematic situation where their imports are greater than exports, which leads to very high external debt because their imports are denominated in US dollars. So they have to settle the payments in US dollars in general. So they have a large external debt denominated in dollars, and they depend heavily on foreign lenders. And when you look at the root causes of this trade deficit, the root causes of the external debt, you identify the following issues. Most of their trade deficit is energy deficit, so imports of oil and natural gas, fossil fuels, and food deficits. Most of these regions, most of these countries, the entire region is a net importer of food, Egypt being one of the biggest, especially imports of wheat, one of the biggest in the world. And then I also want to add this, which is low value added export industries. So low value added meaning you import a lot of components, you import a lot of low value added, high value added components, you put them together in an assembly line domestically, and then you export the final product. but your contribution to the production process is a very low value added content. So the net effect is that you're importing more value added than what you're exporting. So you're constantly digging yourself into a bigger hole. And that's a major industrialization failure in the region that contributes to this heavy external debt. So the root causes that I want to focus on primarily here are the energy deficits and the food deficits. And the traditional policy advice that you hear from the World Bank and the IMF, and this has been going on since the 90s, is a whole series of policy prescriptions that, in my view, have just made things worse over the years. So rely on tourism. The problem with tourism, well, they say rely on tourism because it brings in dollars, right, to pay off the external debt. It's high energy industry, high water consumers, massive use of resources. So if you factor in the environmental costs of tourism, the net effect is a negative effect in the region, especially with climate change happening in the way that I highlighted earlier today. Tourism is just not a good solution in the long run. Foreign direct investment, FDI. The problem is that, again, you end up with low value added foreign direct investment, huge environmental costs, because there is a race to the bottom. In order to attract, a little bit of foreign direct investment, you have a whole bunch of countries around the world racing to the bottom, lowering their standards, offering incentives to foreign companies to set up shop. And those companies, what are they doing? They're hiring local workers, low-skilled workers, assembly line type of jobs to produce low value-added content. So again, not a solution in the long term. So I keep emphasizing this race to the bottom. Even tourism is a race to the bottom. Who offers the cheapest stuff? Export-led growth. So the idea is to turn those countries from net importers to net exporters through industrializations. Well, it turns out if you specialize in low value added content because of labor skills are not as developed, not advanced as industrialized countries, you end up just being an assembly line. So you end up importing more inputs, more value added in the inputs that you're bringing in than what you're exporting. And we've seen this over the years for almost all developing countries. The net effect is in negative terms of trade over the years. So the current export-led growth model is actually backfiring for most of these countries. Financial liberalization, open up your financial markets to international investors. It brings in speculative bubbles. It brings in a lot of financial markets instability, which has long-lasting effects. So not a good idea in the long term, at least for the region right now. Relying on remittances, so your own citizens working abroad and sending money back home. There's brain drain. Obviously, you're sending the best and the brightest to work in Europe and the United States. So you're investing hundreds of millions of dollars to produce skilled and educated workers, and then you're shipping them abroad for other economies to benefit from their productivity. And you're hoping that they'll send some money back home. So that's another strategy that a lot of countries in the region and across the world have used. And then comes the heavy push from the World Bank, which is privatizing state-owned enterprises. So getting the government to sell some of the major utilities, water companies, electricity companies, telecommunication companies, airlines, and so on. And these are companies that historically absorb quite a bit of unemployment. But once they're privatized, you can't control them in the same way you used to control your own assets. And a lot of this has happened already through the 90s. So austerity measures, reducing government spending, government involvement, reducing government subsidies, and then sort of getting to the last resort, which is more debt restructuring. So whatever your external debt level is, you just sit down and renegotiate with the lenders and stretch out the payment for another 30 years or 50 years. But you're never getting out of that vicious cycle. So it's really more external debt to finance already existing external debt. So none of these strategies addresses the root causes that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is energy deficits and food deficits, food production deficits. So no matter what you do with these policies, you're actually not producing more food. You're not turning your economy away from being a trade deficit, being a food deficit country to a food surplus country, or you're not turning your country from a net energy importer to a net energy producer. The only way to do this is by investing in renewable energy policy. And this day and age, with the technology that's available to us, especially for the region in terms of solar energy, in terms of the potential for geothermal energy, there's a massive opportunity that's becoming cheaper and cheaper by the day. And a lot of countries, unfortunately, are waking up to this reality a little bit too late. We see some of the Gulf countries in particular investing massively in solar and renewable, but still it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the potential is. And this would have been, should have been done at least 10 to 15 years ago, if not earlier than that. So it's too little, too late. Sustainable agriculture policy is the only way to, at the same time, address climate change and turn the economy towards more local food production. Water management policy, conservation policy, green architecture and design. I mean, some of the new cities that are built in the Middle East at this point, they're the antithesis of what we would consider sustainable, and massive energy consumers that will drag the region into more energy consumption in the near future. Looking towards ecotourism as a different kind of tourism that's more sustainable in terms of architecture, in terms of food, in terms of water use. So a different kind of economic system that's more decentralized, more localized ecosystem, and relying exclusively on sustainable food and sustainable energy production. And finally, investing in education and vocational training is extremely important, especially on the point of low value added content of exports. The only way you're going to move up the ladder, so to speak, in terms of your export content is by producing higher skills, both in the educational field, the traditional educational path, but also vocational technical skills. And that's the only way to move away from low value added content of industrial production to high value added content of industrial production. And that's a long-term strategy. It's not going to happen overnight, and it requires a long-term investment in education and an industrial strategy that's geared in that direction. And then finally, in terms of free trade, there's a lot of literature on South-South trade. So trade between countries that are equally competitive, kind of complementing at the regional level their economic system, as opposed to trading across the globe with, long distance transportation and so on. And I'll leave it at that. I'll just close by saying that what I see is a lot of negative effects of climate change happening and intensifying in the region. This intensification is going to essentially make things worse in terms of competition over water resources and energy resources and so on. And it's going to put more stress, political and social stress, in larger cities. And that becomes the fuel for social conflict, for political conflict. The only way to reverse some of that is to have a very aggressive local, regional, and international policy to fight climate change and to redesign an economic system that's more sustainable. And I'll stop here. I'll take questions. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, how are developing nations going to be able to develop renewable energy with the often high initial costs that are associated with it? It's like, what's the policy recommendation for that?
Right. So this is not just an economic issue. It's also an international relation issue, because climate change is not just affecting developing countries. It's affecting developed countries too. But it's true. Developing countries are suffering more severe consequences and should be moving faster than anybody else towards sustainable renewable energy. So it depends on which country you're looking at. It depends on which technology you're looking at. So you have major countries that are now large-scale producers of solar panels and sustainable renewable energy technology. So I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of Germany. These are industries that are massive job creators for those countries. And if we're going to seriously fight climate change on a World War II type of scale, then we have to increase collaboration in that direction. So I'll give you the example of Tunisia. Tunisia, I'm from Tunisia, so I'll give you this example. Tunisia is a relatively small economy, small country, about 10, 11 million people. It's a net importer of food. It's the net importer of energy. Our number one trading partner is China. So most of our imports these days come from China. And when you're trying to negotiate, trade deals with a country like China, what is Tunisia going to export to China that's not already produced in China? Pretty much nothing, right? So you can negotiate a long-term agreement of buying solar panels, installing large-scale solar farms in Tunisia that would give you 100% electricity production in a matter of less than a year. So the quantity of electricity, the volume of electricity that Tunisia needs annually, China installs that solar capacity in less than 6 months. And they're already doing it in China, which is, for China's economy, it's a drop in the bucket. But that's 6 months worth of investment that will completely free up a country like Tunisia from having to worry about electricity production. Then you can worry about other problems and you can tackle the next big thing. So it's these kinds of negotiations that you don't hear. Instead, this is what Tunisia is negotiating right now. They're negotiating with a group of European countries, mostly Germany and the Netherlands, I think, to build the largest solar farm in the world in Tunisia, in the desert in Tunisia, and then to export 100% of that electricity production to the European market. So this is still that same obsession with exports that policymakers in developing countries like Tunisia are obsessed with, and they're so excited about the opportunity to export electricity to Germany. But that means that 100% of Tunisia's electricity consumption will still remain from fossil fuels. So we still import oil to fuel electricity production for the domestic market, and then we use the solar energy to export to Europe. Why not build that for the local market and then free up your economy, your economic priorities to address other issues? So there's the cost. The initial cost is a serious obstacle, but we're not saying build the largest solar farm in 6 months. You don't have to do that. You can start on a smaller scale, but have a long-term strategy to reach 100% renewable electricity production within 10 years, within 20 years, within 30 years. So if you have to borrow money to do it, borrow money and invest it in the areas that matter the most, which is, as I'm highlighting here, is sustainable energy and sustainable food production. So it's a tricky situation for a lot of countries that are heavily indebted already, and their priority, because of the lenders are putting pressure and saying, pay me first, then buy your solar panels, right? And that becomes a political issue, obviously, an international relations issue. So developing countries as a whole collectively need to strengthen their bargaining position and say, well, the priority maybe is not paying the debt first. The priority maybe should be saving the climate so we can, live long enough to pay the debt. You see what I mean? I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Question? Go ahead.
Is the only way kind of to get these renewable energy businesses in there to invest from non-domestic companies, get investment from non-domestic companies, or are there some cases, some countries that can get their domestic businesses to build these renewable energy plants, like in Tunisia, do they not have the, capital to do so?
Right. So the good news for some developing countries like Tunisia, like Morocco, like Jordan, is that the labor skills, the technical skills, are available domestically. You don't have to import the labor skills. The installation, the management of renewable energy technology will be done domestically and will not require imports. The only imports that's blocking the way here is importing the solar panels. importing the wind turbines. So this is where the financing question becomes tricky. So I mentioned South-South trade. If you have the technical skills, and if you build a coalition of 10, 15, 20 countries, developing countries, that recognize that their common weakness is energy production, and recognize that the only solution for them is renewable energy production, then you can pool resources together to build large-scale production capacity to produce solar panels, first for the region internally, and then eventually for exports to other parts of the world. The problem is that most developing countries are divided, and they're so burdened by their external debt that they don't even have room or fiscal policy space to engage in alternative ways of rethinking their priorities and rethinking their economic system. But in many cases, relying on domestic resources is the best way, and those resources are available. The question is always about the financing and prioritizing the financing. And unfortunately, most countries, in this case, have that limitation. Not everybody, obviously. So the oil exporting countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, and all of these countries have massive export surpluses and should be the leaders in the world, and especially in the region, and turning their economies very quickly to 100% renewable electricity production. Some estimates already put Saudi Arabia, which is one of the largest oil producers in the world, the estimates is that by 2038, which is not too far in the future, Saudi Arabia will become a net importer of oil if it stays on this path, right? Because Saudi Arabia already consumes a lot of its own oil production domestically. And by 2038, everything else remaining the same as today, Saudi Arabia will become an importer of oil, which will completely destroy the Saudi economy, which is why finally the Saudi government is waking up to this reality and now is announcing major investments in renewable energy, which is good, but it's a little too late. This should have been done on a large scale at least 10, 15 years ago, if not earlier. So for a region that claims to have quite a bit in common culturally and politically and economically, this is an area of economic cooperation between the oil-rich countries that have the resources and the oil-poor countries that their common goal right now is renewable energy production. But unfortunately, it's everyone for themselves, as you know. The recent conflicts in the region simply don't make those policy choices as obvious as they should be. And once again, climate change and intensifying the tension in the region is not helping either.
Yes. Say.
How is the South-Side trade going to work if most of these developing countries mostly are highly dependent on countries like China for their products?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Can you please come here? This is the mic. I can't stretch it for the. Thank you. Please, let me see if I can show you.
Yeah, I can see you.
You can see her?
Yep.
How is the South-South trade going to work if most of these developing countries are highly dependent on countries like China for their products and services?
Oh, for products and services?
Yes.
Or you mean for like solar panel production?
Yes.
You're talking in general?
In general.
Oh, in general. So the high dependence on imports from China is a recent phenomenon, right? In the region for developing countries in general. I mean, traditionally, most developing countries are highly dependent on the former colonial authority, France or England or Spain and so on. So the issue of dependence is not new, right? Dependence in terms of food imports, energy imports, technology imports. So I don't think it's a particular China issue. It's a post-colonial dependency situation And now it's taking on a new form because of the much cheaper, more competitive Chinese products that are flooding the global economy. But you know, in order for those economies to continue to buy made in China products at a higher rate in the future, they need to have an economy to speak of, right? And if their economy is going into a vicious cycle of self-destruction, that's not in the interest of China either. And you already see this in terms of foreign direct investment by China in many developing countries, but it's strategic investment that benefits primarily the Chinese economy. So it's in countries that are selling raw materials that the Chinese economy needs, right? But this is what gives you, you know, for developing countries, as a sovereign nation, you have the right and the responsibility to negotiate trade deals and investment deals that are fair, that are balanced, that are equal. And it's hard for developing countries to do it one-on-one. You know, one small developing country negotiating with the United States is not going to work. That's why the South-South coalitions are not just economic coalitions, but also political, you know, putting your political weight together and your economic weight together to get a better deal. And we start seeing a little bit of this with the BRICS group. BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as one kind of political group that has a significant economic weight to counterbalance the weight of the United States and Western Europe. But it's also a political organization too. So those are the types of coalitions that can get developing countries better deals and can set a path for a different kind of economic development. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Can bring.
Since you said that this is clearly not the main cause of the conflict, but contributing to the conflict, I wanted to see what your estimation then was, because I can certainly also see a development that would actually ease the conflict, and that would be out-migration. I mean, we're assuming that, you know, due to rising waters, rising temperatures, water shortages, and so on, that lots of people ultimately will have to leave where they're currently living and migrate somewhere else. We could also make the argument that we've already seen quite a lot of people migrate out of the region due to all the conflict, and we know that a lot of them will return, but we also know, if it's similar to prior conflicts, that lots of them will not return to their homeland. So do you see simultaneously a larger increase in out-migration happening in the region due to the problems that you see that would, again, ease the potential for conflict over this a little bit?
Well, I don't know if it will ease the conflict. I mean, outward migration is already happening. I mean, the Syrian refugees that are referred to in the beginning, quite a bit of those refugees prior to the conflict are technically climate refugees, right? So climate refugees that move to urban cities, but also climate refugees that go unnoticed. They're sort of invisible in the global economy because people leave because they're looking for better economic opportunities, and they don't carry a card that says I'm a climate refugee. So we're going to see more of this happening as economic opportunities become less available, and as climate change make those economies just not conducive to creating jobs and prosperity for those individuals. The challenge, as you mentioned, is where are those people going to go, right? Because we're not talking about a handful of people from one country. This is an entire region that within our lifetime will become uninhabitable. So we're talking about dozens and dozens of millions of people moving out. So this brings in the issue of migration globally. Western Europe is not necessarily the most welcoming to large-scale immigration. The United States, Australia, all the traditional recipients of migrants from the region are tightening the grip in terms of inward migration towards Europe and the United States. So I see that as another potential source of conflict elsewhere. We already see the kind of alt-right movements in the US and Western Europe, even in the Nordic countries, kind of anti-immigration movement, especially anti-Middle Eastern immigration movement. So it may reduce some of the conflict tensions in the region as people leave, but I think it's like playing a game of whack-a-mole globally. I don't think it's a good thing either way.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes.
How much do major terror organizations in these regions like Boko Haram and ISIS affect, I guess, policies trying to be implemented to counteract environmental degradation?
So the presence of terrorism in the region, especially groups like ISIS. I'm trying to repeat the question so other people can hear it later on the live stream. You know, the thing with terrorism, especially the ISIS kind of terrorism, it's relatively, you know, minor organization in terms of its size. It's just amazing the amount of territory that they were able to capture in the middle of the chaos of the conflict in Syria and in Iraq over the last few years. Their numbers are shrinking, their territory is shrinking, but the fact that they can, you know, pop up anywhere in the world and commit acts of terrorism still makes it a factor. I don't see it as a threat or an obstacle to developing renewable energy or reorganizing the economic systems. If anything, I see it as a major part of the solution. So if we invest in redesigning the economic system, because one of the things that I didn't mention here about the region as a whole is youth unemployment is extremely high. If you look at a country like Tunisia, one of the largest, you know, contributors in terms of members of ISIS, high levels of youth unemployment, lack of economic opportunities, high level of inequality, especially in the most rural areas that are the most affected by climate change and by these droughts. If you eliminate the root cause of, you know, pushing people into those kinds of organizations like ISIS, not only improve the economy, improve quality of life, but also you're eliminating the source that feeds some of these terrorist organizations. So I don't think that fighting terrorism and investing in climate change should be competing with each other. I see it as part of the solution, actually.
Already 6 o'clock. So, anyone? Any more questions? No one? Okay. So.
Well, thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you Shakuntala for organizing this session. And if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint via email with Professor Das, and feel free to email me or send me a message if you have any questions to clarify. Thank you again.